Well, it only took 5 years, a few billion opinions, and the rise and fall of mRNA vaccines. But the Trump administration has just released a new website telling us where COVID came from. Is this nonsense or genuine scientific curiosity? Some of the moments from the early pandemic are etched into my memory. I remember watching these giant 747s carrying ailing passengers from China to MCAS Miramar, which was just a few miles from the clinic where I worked. I remember getting a sinking feeling in my stomach. The pandemic was here, and there would be no way to stop the spread of an airborne virus. One of the oddest parts of the early pandemic was how it turned normal people into armchair epidemiologists. Suddenly, everyone had an idea of how to stop the spread, how the virus worked, and what were the best ways to prevent infection. This discourse supercharged an already poor understanding of biology and outbreaks. This led to a distrust in science, medicine, vaccines, and scientific authority at large. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was assumed that the virus outbreak originated from a wet market in Wuhan, China. These types of wet markets are perfect for zoonotic spillovers. A large number of animals, kept in close quarters, often being slaughtered and sold at the market itself. It's not hard to envision a virus jumping species from a bat, pangolin, or bird into people at one of these markets. I was led to believe that this was the most likely source of the pandemic, so I dismissed all other theories. At the time, the true origin of the pandemic didn't really matter to me. The virus was out in the world and it was causing real harm, and this type of discourse about its origin was distracting people from treatments and getting the help that they actually need.
So when it comes to talking about the origins of COVID, that was my paradigm. It would have been nearly impossible to establish the origin of COVID, and the conversation was charged in a lack of data and racism. This is a little story. I attended a talk in the spring of 2022, and a couple of virologists from all over the world, including some of our collaborators, were speaking. And they were taking questions from the audience, and one of the first questions that was asked was, well, what do you think about the lab leak theory of COVID? And they spent, I want to say, like 40 to 50% of the entire session just talking about the lab leak theory. And it was interesting seeing them all systematically destroy the lab leak theory. They were saying there's no evidence, there's no data, there's no real reason for people to believe that it came from a lab. That kind of cemented my worldview. It jived with what I understand about virology and outbreaks. And so when I went back into kind of normal, non-academic life, I would tell people that I attended this talk and that, foremost virologists don't believe that it came from a lab. And I'd basically dismiss all of the hypotheses at face value because it disagreed with the evidence that I had been shown. And to be honest, I kind of mocked people that believed in the lab leak theory, but I didn't take them seriously. I didn't listen to them at all. All of the experts in my life, from the government, from academia, were saying that there's no chance that this came from a lab. Maybe a couple years later, I'll have the exact date in the video, you'll see it on screen. I remember seeing this article in the New York Times. It was called Why the Pandemic Started in a Lab in 5 Key Points. And I remember sitting back in my chair at work, opening the article, cracking my knuckles, and being like, I'm about to tear this piece apart. The first thing I did was look at the byline. Who wrote the article? And this piece was actually written by a doctor, a molecular biologist at MIT. And that was my first green flag, to be honest. I was expecting some right-wing quack or some niche physician who wasn't an expert in the field making bold claims about the origin of COVID. It was written by Dr. Alina Chan, a molecular biologist at MIT. And so I did not dismiss the article outright, and I kept on reading. As she mentions in her piece, there are 5 key points that point towards a lab leak origin, or at least reasons why we shouldn't dismiss the lab leak. So let's go through each one of those one at a time. So she begins by crafting a geographical argument. The outbreak began in Wuhan, China, but many of the historic SARS-like viruses aren't found near that city. Most of them are found 1,000 miles away in caves in Laos or mines in southern China. And if you were expecting a zoonotic spillover event, you would probably find people infected with the virus closer to where the reservoir of the virus is, being in Laos and southern China. And we don't see any of that evidence. We see that the first cases come from Wuhan, not from Laos, and not from southern China. So that's interesting. There are many large population centers close to the mine and to the caves. So we would expect that if this was a natural spillover event, the cases would first happen near those sites. So how did the virus make it all the way to Wuhan? So let's talk a little bit about the Wuhan Virology Center. In addition to this kind of geographical discrepancy is the fact that Wuhan is home to one of the foremost labs researching SARS-like viruses. This institute was looking for new versions of SARS-like viruses. They were studying these viruses. The first SARS pandemic actually started in southern China, so this type of institute was set up to monitor outbreaks like this. The lead scientist at the institute, Dr. Shi, was fascinated about how coronaviruses jump from species to species. Dr. Shi's group at the Wuhan Institute took samples from humans, from animals, and people working in these wet markets to try to find novel coronaviruses so that they could study how they jump from species to species. Much of this work was conducted and funded with EcoHealth Alliance, which is a US-based funding group who supported the Institute with over $80 million in funding since the year 2002. On its face, it's really not all that interesting, but when we get to points later on, it will start to make a little bit more sense. Right now, she's laying the groundwork for the next points. Right now, it doesn't really make sense why this virology center, why this virology lab really has anything to do with the outbreak itself. Let's recap point 1. The outbreak started 1,000 miles away from the natural reservoirs of the virus. There's an institute in Wuhan that studies novel coronaviruses and how they jump from species to species, and that they were supported by funding from international sources. So Dr. Chan's second point is where I think this argument really gets juicy. Dr. Chan writes, "The laboratory pushed risky research that resulted in viruses becoming more infectious. Coronaviruses were grown from samples from infected animals and genetically reconstituted and recombined to create new viruses unknown in nature. These viruses were passed through cells from bats, pigs, primates, and humans, and were used to infect civets and humanized mice. In essence, this process forced these viruses to adapt to new host species, and the viruses with mutations that allowed them to thrive emerged as victors." That's a lot to take in. Basically, she's saying is that these scientists passaged viruses through different organisms to artificially get them to jump from species to species. This kind of artificial selection is where scientists select for traits in viruses or other organisms that they want. When you think about artificial selection, you can think about dog breeds. When I think about evolving viruses, it doesn't necessarily need to be risky. In my experience, we can evolve bacteriophages to have the traits that we want so that we can use them in human health or other therapeutic avenues. We can make them more lytic. We can make them evolve to infect new hosts. We can remove resistance genes. We can do a lot of different things through this artificial passaging process. It wouldn't be an ATB video if something didn't go horribly wrong while trying to make it. Obviously, my camera died, so I have to record or re-record this entire section. So let's continue. In 2021, The Intercept published a leaked 2018 grant proposal for a research project named Diffuse, which had been written as a collaboration between EcoHealth, the Wuhan Institute, and Rolf Barrick at the University of North Carolina. The proposal described plans to create viruses strikingly similar to SARS-CoV-2. The Diffuse project proposed to search and create SARS-like viruses carrying spikes with a unique feature, a furin cleavage site, the same feature that enhances SARS-CoV-2's infectiousness in humans, making it capable of causing a pandemic. Diffuse was never funded by the United States. However, in his testimony, Dr. Fauci explained that the Wuhan Institute would not need to rely on U.S. funding to pursue research independently. Holy shit. As like a biomedical researcher, it is crazy to me that you would even conceive of creating pandemic strains or trying to increase infectivity in a coronavirus. I understand the need to understand how these viruses work, but to go ahead and create or propose to create these types of viruses is insane to me. Dr. Chan's third point is about the biosafety conditions in the lab. I think this is probably one of the weakest parts of her argument, but it goes like this. The Wuhan Institute was capable of up to BSL-4 biosafety, which means the highest, most strict level of biosafety, respirators, negative airway, pressure hallways, gloves, biosafety cabinets, pretty much anything that you can imagine to contain extremely virulent outbreaks. But that this diffuse project was slated to be in biosafety 2, BSL level 2, which is much more lax. It only requires gloves and can be basically worked in open air in the lab. To me, this is her weakest point because we don't know what the inside of the lab looks like. This proposal was never funded, so we don't actually know what the final project looked like. Dr. Chan explains that this sort of lax biosafety was a feature and not a bug of this proposal, that the Institute wanted to keep costs down and would say they could do the research cheaper than other people in the world because they were going to do it at a lower biosafety level. So that's pretty concerning as as somebody who works in BSL2, BSL3 labs. To cut corners for like potential monetary savings is kind of gross, and if you're thinking about saving money while doing research, you probably shouldn't be doing infectious disease research. So points 4 and 5 are pretty similar, so I'm going to lump them kind of together. Point 4, she says that to explore the origins of COVID, there was a lot of research done on finding which animals in particular and which humans actually got sick at the wet market. Several research articles have been posted about this, and all of that genetic data is free and publicly available. And she says that the genetic data from these studies suggest that the virus began to circulate in humans before reaching the wet market, and that the most convincing part of all of these research studies is that there was never an animal that tested positive for the virus. Every animal that tested positive can be linked back to a human origin and not the other way around. So in the due diligence for these research papers, scientists took samples from people and all of the animals in the supply chain that lead to this wet market, and none of the samples turned back any results that look like COVID or SARS-CoV-2, meaning that it is unlikely that animals in the wet market actually were the origin of this pandemic. And her fifth and final point is about finding viral origins in other outbreaks. It actually has been done before. We have found the origin of the first SARS pandemic and MERS, which was in 2002 and 2012, respectively. And she writes that during the first SARS outbreak in 2002 and MERS in 2012, infected animals were found. Earliest known human cases were linked to animals, and antibodies against the virus were found in animals and animal traders. So basically there was a concrete line, a direct line between the animals, the infected animals, and the people who got sick. People who worked with the infected animals got sick. There were antibodies in the people who worked with the animals against the pandemic strains of the virus. So a very clear correlation could be drawn about viral origins. But Chan writes that none of this is true for COVID. There has been no direct link between animals and people. In fact, all of the infections in animals can be led back to human origins, not the other way around. So Dr. Chan ends her piece as forcefully as a scientist can sound. She does not outright endorse the lab leak theory, but thinks that scientists should have examined all avenues, all hypotheses, and to follow the data. And by the case that she's laid out, it's pretty clear where she would begin the search. But I think I need to talk about the limitations of this study. The Diffuse project was never funded. Though moving and convincing, you have to remember that this is in the opinion section of the New York Times, not necessarily known for its factual analysis. This is not in a peer-reviewed journal. Other scientists did not look over this to make sure that all of the arguments were sound and the evidence and data back up her claims. All of her assertions are based on incomplete data, and she would tell you that. I'm sure if you asked her to scrutinize her own work, she would say, yes, there's missing data here, but that should be a red flag and tell you there's more going on here than what we have data for. And I think that's part of the reason why she wrote this piece, is that because we're missing all of this data and we don't have clear links, we shouldn't just assume that the virus started in a wet market, and that scientists should really take a look at where this virus came from, because the implications of a lab leak are very different than if it was a natural spillover event caused by zoonosis.
I have no idea where COVID came from. To be completely honest with you, the grant application with the modified genome is incredibly damning. At the very least, it's incredibly suspicious. I forwarded this piece to my colleagues and other molecular biologists. There was a postdoc and a PhD applicant. And, it really moved them. It convinced them that there may be something here, that there may be another side to the origin of COVID that we weren't exposed to. I must admit, Dr. Chan is incredibly persuasive and the piece is moving. I have complicated thoughts about pushing the current administration to perform a investigation into the origin of COVID. I have no faith that a full, thorough investigation can be led by an administration who is actively trying to rewrite history. And the xenophobia and anti-China sentiment generated by the release of this website is unproductive at best and intentionally harmful at worst. These days, it's really challenging to have a nuanced conversation about COVID, let alone its origins. In no way, shape, or form do I agree with the current administration or their revisionist version of history, but as a scientist, I fight these feelings of curiosity. I want to know where the virus came from. I think about the origin of Ebola and the origin of HIV and how instrumental those were to predicting other viral outbreaks and all of the information that can be learned when we find the true origin. What are the reservoir species? What species should we be monitoring? All of this is really important information so that we have the tools to combat the next outbreak. As a scientific community, we owe it to the world to approach this topic with an open mind and follow the data. I don't think we spend enough time as a scientific community actually exploring the questions that the general public has asked. And the origin of COVID is one of those questions. It's just so difficult that it's marred in so much politics and hate that even if we got to some sort of scientific answer, there'd be broad swaths of the population who think that there's something else at play. Personally, I'm stuck on the grant application. I have two concluding thoughts that I want to leave you with. Firstly, finding the origin of any viral pandemic is fraught with danger and approaches the limit of human technology. And lastly, as a molecular biologist, as a scientist, as a citizen, I am terrified that a hostile nation may be playing around with pandemic strains of viruses like it's some sort of game or some sort of race to be won. I can't see any value in actually doing these genetic modifications and seeing what happens. It seems like a really, really high risk for a relatively low reward. I'll leave you with a quote from the book Spillover by David Quayman. He writes, "There is no reason to assume that AIDS will stand unique as the only such global disaster caused by a strange microbe emerging from some other animal. Some knowledgeable and gloomy prognosticators even speak of the next big one as an inevitability. Will the next big one be caused by a virus? Will the next one come out of the rainforest or a market in southern China? Will the next one kill 30 or 40 million people?"